series are brought to you by QAI. They're very kind in that they don't kibitz with me about stuff that I can and can't say. So it really is a true education effort that they're engaged in. If you don't know these guys, they do effortless digital conversion. They basically focus on this question of how do you take all that paper and all that backfile stuff and turn it into something of value. They have a brand new website, which I think is really cool. So if you haven't been there, you haven't checked a look at it, take a look. So without further ado, let me hop off to Michael Horsley, who I'm really pleased to be here. The way this session will work today is that we will go through probably, 12, 13 slides to start off with. And Michael will lay out some background. What we're trying to do here is not just regurgitate what's in the digitization guide, because there are a lot of places in which people have started to do that. But what we want to do is peek under the covers a bit and give people a sense of, well, why are these things the way they are? How do they evolve in the way they are? What does it actually mean in terms of, operations? So that's the emphasis that we want to give this during the course of our time here today. After the first session, to give you a little bit of a breather before Michael deep dives into some really interesting technical stuff, we'll have just a 2 or 3 question poll just to kind of take the pulse of everybody and also help me structure what we talk about in the future moving forward. So Michael, let me introduce why don't you introduce yourself and we will get started.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. I want to start out by saying that I am not an archivist, nor am I an image scientist. A photographer with a history degree, and I kind of fell into this profession, and it's been a wonderful journey so far. And so, as John said, I'm Michael Horsley, and I want to thank you so much for inviting me to talk about NARA's digitization regulations for federal agencies. I'm also aware that you had extended an invitation to my colleagues, Jeff Reed and Kevin DeVorsey, who had also given a presentation, I believe. And so we hope that this thread continues and that we'll have an ability to interact with your community. And it's a great platform to discuss these topics. So I'm an electronic records policy analyst with the Records Management and Policy team in agency services of the Chief Records Officer at the National Archives. That is a mouthful, but basically we're the part of the archives that relates to federal agencies. We interact with the records management policies in particular. But a little bit about me, I served on the preservation team with the Smithsonian Institution Archives many years ago. And I was a photographer for the conservation division at the Library of Congress. And I served a stint as a digitization specialist in NARA's digital imaging lab. And I formerly served as a team lead in NARA's corporate records management. So, and currently I'm a policy analyst in the Chief Records Officer office, where I'm responsible for developing the technical standards for NARA's digitization regulations, as well as other records management policies. I'm also a technical editor for the latest federal agency digital guideline initiatives, also known as FADGI, the May 23 Technical Guidelines, 3rd edition. They're all important. Where also I authored a digitization code of ethics that is modeled after similar codes found in the American Institute of Conservation and the Society of American Archivists, as well as developing standards for mass digitization of modern paper documents with FADGI. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about, again, a little bit more background about who we are. The Office of Chief Records Officer provides guidance to support federal agencies in achieving their federal records management responsibilities. We create a variety of different products, which is primarily we issue bulletins which articulate NARA's records management policy. So they're more like explanatory materials that are official policy, but they augment things like official products like regulations. We also maintain regulations related to records management. We publish FAQs and other products to clarify records management issues and responsibilities for agencies. Some of the key documents we've made in the past are the 2015 metadata guidance for the transfer of permanent records and the revised format guidance for the transfer of permanent electronic records that contains tables of preferred and accepted file formats for a variety of different, mostly born digital records at this point with the publication of the regulations. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about the regulation that technically is called 36 CFR Part 1236. It's a mouthful, Subpart E. We've published, the regulations describe the standards and procedures that must be applied when digitizing permanent records using reflective digitization techniques. So that's paper records with using a scanner. Such records include paper, documents, prints, bound volumes, photographic prints, and mixed media records. The regulation does not apply to photographic negatives, transparencies, or aerial film, micrographs, microfilm, radiographic x-rays that must be digitized using transmissive techniques. We are currently working on that. I'll talk a little bit about that in maybe the next slide. Nor do we have standards yet for dynamic media, including motion picture and audiovisual records. That's to come. The digitization part is structured to include mandatory and recommended requirements such as records prep, documentation requirements, digitization requirements for permanent paper, quality control inspection, and validation. The vast majority of federal records, though, are temporary. And we purposely designed the standards for this, what's called Subpart D, temporary records, that is not a very strict requirement because we want to allow agencies freedom to choose the most practical approach to meeting their needs. The main requirement is that you'll be able to use the digitized versions for the same business purposes as the original. That may imply, though, that you have to digitize to, the equivalent of FADGI 3-star and above standards. It all depends on what the nature is of the information in both permanent and temporary records. NARA's digitization, I'm going to try to delve into a little bit of trying to illuminate the distinctions between some very confusing relationships between maybe FADGI and ISO and the regulations, but NARA's digitization standards are an endorsement of FADGI specifications and their image analysis methodology. FADGI is an implementation, though, of standards found in the ISO 19264 digitization standards for cultural heritage materials. So the ISO basically is the accumulation of all the best practice science behind image quality and codifying it into different levels of quality and proposing analytical methods. FADGI has taken that and created a way of applying this for museums, libraries, and archives. So next slide, please. So what we're currently working on are digitization requirements for film records. It describes the standards and procedures which must be applied when digitizing the permanent records, which are photographic negatives, transparencies, aerial film, roll film, micrographic, and radiographic materials, also known as X-rays. Now, I'll be touching upon this topic many times, but in this particular case, we have selected the equivalent of FADGI 3-star as the minimum for microfilm and film materials. That does not mean that that's all you have to do. It depends on the film materials are highly complex objects, and they will require a very high level of expertise, and they're very complex to meet the requirements. We understand the difficulties involved in this, particularly for small agencies, but we have we have a very serious mandate that the government needs to go basically digital, and that these records will be destroyed. We are not going back. We will not be able to go back and re-digitize if we've made a mistake. So our first recommendation is that you identify your records and transfer them as soon as possible before the upcoming deadline. It doesn't mean you have to digitize by the deadline. It means that we won't take any analog records after the deadline. And so that's something that if we get questions in this presentation, my quick answer is, consult with your agency's records officer, your general counsel, your senior staff to come up with the proper policies and procedures how to approach this complex problem. And then finally, dynamic media is going to be problematic. I will not shy away from saying this right now. Again, another example of where perhaps you should identify those materials and send them in. The major problem with dynamic media is that unlike still and transmissive records, there is not a very large, there's a large body of practice that is developed, but not a internationally recognized standards like we have with paper documents and film digitization. And so that's going to be a problem, but we do have approaches that we think can work, but we'll be working in consultation with a lot of different subject matter experts within NARA and in the industry. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk more deeply later on about quality management. I want to plant this seed though now, because we're going to be, you cannot have enough of this concept drilled in. The Deming quote in particular is the guiding principle from which I learned from Steve Puglia and Tom Rieger, and hopefully I'm doing a good job of passing this on. And this is the one quote that has always been my driving philosophy. Quality comes not from inspection, but from improvement of the process. I know that people are digitizing things and then figuring out whether they're permanent or temporary. I know they've gone out because of the budgetary requirements. They've gone out and bought equipment, and now they're trying to figure out how to make it happen. I know that these recommendations to do it right the first time, but I cannot tell you that it's true. I can't tell you enough that it is true. I see people asking about, essentially they use the word quality control, and that is inspection. And if you're finding problems in inspection that are egregious, then you're in big trouble. That is not the place to improve your process, because a lot of times the records have already been, through the production line, and it's very difficult and costly to go repeat it. We'll talk a little bit more about exceptions and non-compliant records in a couple slides from now, but I just want to plant the seed now. Next slide, please. Another, and this is one of my own particular concern, is I understand that this is a complicated technical process that many people are approaching it maybe for the first time, or they're beginning the journey of becoming a technical person in this regard. There is a difference, particularly when in the regulatory context, between validating digitized records and verifying digitization process. So I'm not an expert in ISO 9000 or Lean Six Sigma or anything like that, but I do take these principles seriously. Verification is the process that you're doing in quality management, and the standards have been set out, the parameters have been explained, the methodology for analyzing and doing inspection has been codified. So that part of the process is you're verifying that you made the right thing during your digitization process. Validation is a completely different thing. It's actually an executive level as the agency describes it, but it could be anything from your agency head or your senior records agency officer or any delegated entity in your agency that has the authority to double check the work that's been done and verify that, well, there I go, I made that mistake. Validating that every step in the process has been done, from the records management down to the digitization to the quality control, and that what's being spat out in the end. And this is very important, particularly when you're using contractors to meet the requirements. This is the final stamp of approval before it gets sent to NARA. Next slide, please. So I'd like to take a little bit of sidebar here to talk about what is FADGI. So FADGI is a collaborative effort created by federal agencies to articulate a common sustainable set of practices and guidelines for digitized and born digital content. There are two working groups that study issues specific to two major areas: still image and audiovisual. The still image working group concentrates its efforts on image content such as books, manuscripts, maps, and photographic prints and negatives. The still image group, as I said earlier, publishes the technical guidelines for the still image digitization of cultural heritage materials. and it is an online guide to still image digitization best practices. I want to state that the FADGI guidelines are a living document. They're intended to be in an online form. There have been several editions of it published previously. I really encourage people to look at the historic documents because it gives you a sense of where they came from. And there's actually in some of the early, like I think the 2010 publication, there's a little bit more explanation, even though some of the terms and the concepts might be a little bit out of date because of advances in technology. Some of the, it's a great way to start learning what we're talking about when we start getting into all the gobbledygook. But incidentally, FADGI started out kind of based on NARA's 2004 guidelines, which Jeff Reed, Steve Puglia, and Aaron Rhodes were the initial authors of. And that was an attempt to give to the community a set of, hey, here's how NARA is doing it. It was never intended, nor is it intended to serve as requirements for federal agencies to do digitization. It is a description of best practices. And it was written before we've had the developments in image science that we've had today. So many of the concepts are in there. They are not requirements that you can follow. But the early FADGI NARA guidelines defined the set of best practices, but really it's the emergence of the ISO standards such as 19264, as well as the improved testing and image performance measurement tools, the standardization of test targets, and the development of open dice and other analytical software that have allowed us for greater confidence for accurate capture of cultural heritage materials. The overall goal is to create digital products of uniform quality through a standard set of benchmarks for digitization service providers and manufacturers. The primary objective is to produce digital master, I'm sorry, we don't use the word master, we use the word digital primary images that look like the original record and that maintain the essential features of the and information of the original. Next slide, please. I hope I can add some clarity to this kind of complicated topic because the narrative has escaped NARA in terms of the industry is saying, telling you that FADGI 3-star. Now, FADGI 3-star is a great starting point, and you're not going to go wrong if you start pursuing that. But FADGI 3-star and FADGI are not the requirements that federal agencies must follow. FADGI has a lot of really good information, best practices, but there are specific areas where it is not compliant with existing federal records management requirements for agencies. Also, FADGI talks about certain file formats that are not, NARA does not either require them or accept them. FADGI talks about some type of practices that an agency may follow, but they're not the products that we are required as defined what is a permanent record. So we could probably go in, and I don't really want to go in every instance, but I really recommend, my final slide will say this, I encourage people to A, read the regulation, B, read the FADGI guidelines. I think that's a great starting point. But another area of conflict, not conflict, but confusion, FADGI consists of an implementation of the ISO aim points, but it's applied to, they created 14 different records material types from like cartographic, newspaper, and they've divided it into 4 different image quality categories. And we were not able just to say, throw that all at agencies. It would be too cumbersome in a regulation. So we, for better or worse, we developed a concept working with industry and practitioners and institutions that were coming back to us saying, hey, I've got these modern records and our scanners are failing FADGI 3-star testing, but we noticed that they're just modern office documents. And I don't want to go too far down that road because I got a slide about that. But it's kind of confusing because we put in the requirement for modern textual, but we also thought, well, we work with FADGI to create a category for that. And that's your starting point with reflective digitization. If your material does not have a lot of complicated information in it, such as a modern paper document, then you can use the modern textual, which is essentially Not in the test target, there are tone patches. They go from a density from white to black. And in a modern document, there's not a lot of information in that lower register. So why are we measuring and then getting failure when really we've modified this to optimize mass digitization with auto feed scanners for modern office documents that can handle that type of process. So next slide, please. So I kind of want to walk a little bit into, and John, you're going to give me a heads up when we start doing that poll, because we're about to get kind of deep here.
Right after this, right after
okay,
this.
Thank you. So I found this really interesting image on the left here. So the requirements are based on international technical standards and well-established imaging science. As illustrated in this slide, the proper application of the digitization standards is to capture color, tone, and legibility and ensure that all the information in the source record is recorded. On the left is an example from the National Library of Finland. Bless them. They are really cool people. They're at IS&T conferences all the time. And this was a really interesting image that they put up on one of their standards. And it shows the various levels of information loss as you move from a color mode to grayscale and bitonal. Notice that in the grayscale image, the loss of color information, which may or may not represent valuable information. In the bitonal image on the far right, you can see a major loss of information because the scanning mode is not able to capture all the information in the source record. So this is a major point. NARA's regulations, we do not accept bitonal scans because of this risk. That's not to say that bitonal is a bad thing. It's just that there are no standards that govern how you should do it, when you should do it, and what it should look like. And then the potential misapplication by not knowledgeable production operations that are used to doing digitizing checks or non-permanent cultural heritage materials, the misapplication of this and getting bad results is very, very egregious and something that we cannot take the risk. It's not to say that we realize that people know it. There are people who know what they're doing and know how to do it, but it's very difficult for us to put that into a standard. If you look at the image on the right, this is an optimal looking image, an example from NARA's catalog of a properly imaged record. And it includes in the image area a preservation quality reference target. Now, this is a very important document in our holdings. It is the indication of when the end of slavery. It's the document that's behind the Juneteenth holiday, and it is a very dry document, but it has a lot of power within it. And so the authenticity that's inherent in this type of scan, we have a little stamp on there. It's a brief little entry in the bottom of a ledger book. But we have what's called an object level target in this image. That's not required in your digitization. Please read the regulation for how that you should approach that, but it is a good thing to have when you have documents of such cultural importance. So it's through our participation with FADGI and the International Standards Organization that we have authored the new category for mass digitization of modern paper records. We've created the Code of Ethics. That was something that I had recognized at one point, that in the digitization world, we do not have a set of code of practice that governs things like colorization or any types of, as we improve the digitization techniques and interventions we can do with AI, we may lose sight of what the one value that we contain as cultural heritage institutions with that, which is authenticity. And so it's okay to do these things. Please read the Code of Ethics, but we're spelling out what could be proper or improper application of some of these tools and techniques. A major one that happens through neglect and oversight is over sharpening. When I see scans, that is really, I have an example of that, I think, in these slides coming up. But what over sharpening does, particularly the trained eye, it looks artificial. And it looks like, you know, maybe somebody has superimposed text onto a historic document that may not have been there. So this is all about what is called image fluency. And that means you're a skilled operator knowing what looks good and what looks bad. And that's an acquisition of certain types of visual skills. So finally, in this slide, the regulations have influenced developments in electronic records management. I've noticing that digitization manufacturers and in particular service industries are developing, and it's setting a standard for other cultural heritage institutions to follow. Major equipment manufacturers have introduced new scanners that claim to meet FADGI and NARA standards. Electronic management service companies have developed solutions to better manage digitization and records management processes. And software developers have created new tools to monitor quality management and conformance and validation steps. And finally, the standards create a common ground for the public, archivists, records managers, federal agencies, and the private sector to develop workflows, services, and products. I'll leave this slide with an anecdote. Although this is a very complicated topic, I've had many service bureaus and manufacturers in particular come and tell me, thank you very much for codifying some of this, because we've had people come to us and write contracts to say 1,000 DPI, and that doesn't mean anything. Now that we have these, the regulation, it's much easier to write requirements in there, and they're based on terms and approaches that are readily understandable and agreed upon. Thank you.
All right, we're going to do a very quick poll here and allow Michael to catch his breath a little bit. And so let me pull that up and just 3 questions. It'll help me figure out exactly where we are relative to this. Oh, it looks like maybe this has already been acted upon. If you already answered, God bless, you've already answered. I don't know how or why that is, but we'll figure that out. And I thought it might be worth it, while you guys are having the last few minutes of contributing to the poll, let me just end it and share the results. And you should see the results here. And so we won't spend a lot of time on this because Michael still has a lot of content to cover. But you can see that if you don't feel bad, if you're in the early stages of understanding what's going on here, you can see that 72% really are still in the early stages of understanding what this is about. Nothing surprising there, because it is a new area for folks. In terms of what are the biggest issues, you can kind of see going down this tab here, and this is consistent with I've asked this question before, and you can see that people not really understanding what this means in operations, people worried about their current installed base of scanners, the ever-present, which Michael can't solve, lack of funding to implement this. And so, you get a sense of kind of the challenge that folks have out there. So thank you for participating in that. We really do appreciate it. And I will close that down. And, oh, wait. Okay, and I will stop sharing. And we will go back to the presentation. One thing that I noticed, it's really interesting sometimes in this new Zoom, how capabilities come and go. And I don't think that the question tab is open. Yeah. I got a few questions beforehand. I do have those. So we will really push the envelope. I do believe the raise hand capability is functional, and I think I can turn you on live to ask the question. So as Michael goes through, and if you have questions, just hit that little raise hand button that's at the bottom there, and we'll and we'll try and do this live and experiment in real time. So, so Michael, we have about 15, 20 minutes left and then Q&A. So I will go back to the sharing. And you should be on the next slide on modern textual records.
That's correct. John, I think I'm going to throw the script out of the window a little bit. I'm going to pace through these final slides, trying to touch upon some of the key topics. How many participants do we have?
About 50, 60, I think.
Okay. I want to allow for a lot of deep questions and answers. And if there's none, then we can kind of go back to some of the contents. Okay. In this slide here, I found an example in our catalog of what, it's not exactly very modern. It's not laser printed type on white paper, but it is essentially, it's a grayscale image. There's no, as an agency, you need to determine what is the pertinent information, and you need to do a little bit of testing to figure out, hey, can we get away with this? Or, as I showed that slide from the Finnish National Library, is our, I mean, yes, it might be best to scan in color regardless, but if your records primarily look like this and they're very consistent, there's no outliers. That's what and it can fit through an automatic, feed scanner. Like go for it. Go for the next slide. I found this is something that Steve Puglia had developed. I want to talk a little bit about what it is that we're looking at here, because when you go to the regulations or FADGI, you're going to see a table of numbers and concepts, and you're like, what is all this stuff and what does it mean? I don't have the time to go through all of these terms right here. In the regulation, we have definitions. In FADGI, we have a glossary. You can also look at some of the previous FADGI editions to get a better background of how this all developed and how did it end up this way. But this is a very simple image right here that describes clipping or tone reproduction. So it's a combination of, like, we have a reference target that's no longer used anymore, which is the Kodak target. And on that target is a range of tone scale from white to black. The scanning process is you're trying to capture a reasonable range of the original tones. And on the far right would be considered overexposure. And there's clipping and there's a loss of information in the highlight area. In the far left is underexposure, which is loss of information in the shadow area. And you can see in the histogram, which is the bottom area, that's the shifting of the ranges, showing you like, oh, there's a lot of stuff right there and there's nothing on this side. And so that's how it works. And I think let's just keep going to the next slide, because this is probably one of my second or third most major concept that I want to drill in. The number of pixels in a digital image is not a measure of image resolution. The term resolution is one of the most confusing and misunderstood concepts regarding image quality. Terms such as DPI are often used as the sole expression to indicate overall quality, with the implication that the higher DPI or megapixel, the better the image. The more precise definition of resolution is an imaging system's ability to resolve finely spaced detail. Note that the definition does not refer to the DPI, but the ability to resolve detail. Image quality is determined by how well the optics and the signal processing of an image system performs, and not the quantity of pixels in a digital image. The quality of a digital image is determined by how accurate the image system faithfully reproduces the original subject. I'm going to go in a little deep dive here. DPI was an early attempt to relate the input sampling rate of a scanner to the output printing resolution needed to create digital prints. It was something that, meaning you have a printer trying to print something and they say, what should I scan this at? And they're like, well, my printer does about 240 DPI, so do 300 DPI. It's because researchers had determined that the average human eye has a visual acuity close to the equivalent of 300 PPI at a specific viewing distance, meaning 8 by 10 at arm's length. in a practical sense, DPI is merely the addressable resolution of a device, what the device can be set to. It's not the actual scanning resolution or sampling interval that the device is copying. In reality, scanners do not sample at a precise rate, and office grade scanners sacrifice speed over quality. Finally, a DPI scan on a poor device may not be better than a 300 DPI scan on a higher performing device. So how about this one? If the device is out of focus, it doesn't matter what the DPI is. So I won't go into the different types of resolution, but if I've made you more confused, blame it on me. But it's the attempt to say, the question that makes me cringe is what DPI? And that is no longer use that term. It's a suite of different imaging characteristics that go in here. I will explain actually right here in this slide are the 3 different methods. One is about visual observation, and that is all about your human eye's ability to determine detail. That is the traditional way we used to do it. So on the left is the flute. And if you can see where the lines are still kind of separated or they're not blurring together, you can see these little numbers. That's an equatable 500, 600. And the same thing with the other line pair target in the upper right. That is not the method used anymore. It's called a slant edge target. And it's a very complicated and almost impossible for me to describe process, but it uses MTF and SFR. And in the FADGI guidelines, I've read them maybe 1,000 times. There's a graphic in there that just hit me over the head. And it's like, oh yeah, that's the SFR. It's really the contrast between these little lines in the black and white. And the better the machine, the better the contrast separation. And that was all done calculating behind the scenes in analytical software. So you don't have to squint at this stuff. And by the way, each human sees things differently. So we're never going to get an objective result anyways.
Next it reminds me, Michael, a little bit of the DPI conversation, a little bit of the conversation that always exists between precision and accuracy.
Yeah.
And you know, lots of times analysts in particular will put like 5 significant digits after the decimal point to imply accuracy when it really is not that. So.
And I never realized that those digits, I believe that's lean 6, the sigma comes from.
Yeah.
Right. So 6 sigma is 6, degrees off. So this is a brief description. This is, I think I found a better image to describe this, but essentially this is what's happening is that the lens and the signal processing on the left-hand side is your subject matter. And in this case, it's the test target. And then it's interpreted by the lens and then recorded onto the sensor. And then it's processed by the image processing function to go from a digital to, from an analog to digital conversion. And it's the optics and the signal processing that determine the outcome. You go to Target and look at the wall of television screens and notice that they're all different because there's slight variations and they're not calibrated. You go to the grocery store or a new car lot and you'll notice that, oh, I can see they use color calibrated lighting so that they can sell the products. If you go to the grocery store, look at the produce select section, that's got color balanced light so that you can pick the, green lettuce looks green and, apples look red. And I noticed the same one time I was driving back from Frederick, Maryland, and I passed by a car lot. I looked at the car lot. I'm like, oh my God, those are all color balanced, lighting that they have there on their lot. Of course, if you stumble on the lot when they're closed, you're like, I want the red Mercedes, So, that's kind of what's behind some of that image science. Next slide. Okay. This probably deserves a whole nother training session altogether, but I want to show people what in particular the open dice software looks like, because it's not a very user-friendly approach to image analysis, but it is free. But it does require a test target. And so how it works is on the left-hand side is basically you open up the software and you select a certain parameters that you want to test for. And then you import a scan of the test target. And I don't know how well you can see in this example, but there's like little green halo boxes over little areas on the test target. And those are called regions of interest. And what that is, it's a graphic showing you what the software is analyzing. And on that test target are a variety of different different patches that information is being recorded. So in the four corners in the middle is the slant edge resolution target. And so if you notice, it's covering the whole field of view. So it's able to check what's in the center focus and out in the outline areas. In the middle are, on the top and bottom, are white patches and are called step wedge. And those are the tone patches. And then there are color patches above and below that too. And those have those have known qualities to them that the software is analyzing what your scan did and how it processed to what it should have been, because we have the values. It's called a lookup table. And then the far right, again, not a very great user-friendly thing, but it is the results that you get. And it shows you in very great detail areas that are out of alignment or within conformance. I have been suggesting to software developers, and one big name in particular, that it would be very helpful to have maybe an executive report where the technician might benefit from this type of detail, but really a records manager or administrator would benefit more from like how we doing kind of analysis. The question is, if you're 3 points off on the red channel, is that the end of the world? I can't answer that, but I'll leave that hanging out there. Next slide, please. So I want to talk real quickly about some, well, we're really running out of time, but this is an example of a bad scan. There's clipping, there's overexposure, and there's color shifting going on. And this is a result most likely of an office grade scanner being set on automatic. Next slide. On the far left is a horrible scan. It's got what they call cockling. So the paper's all wrinkled, and then it's got uneven illumination. So that's causing clipping in certain areas. There's an area in there. This is my, like, don't try to rely on file naming as your way of managing records, because there's a typo in the file name of this. It's called RG92 PostRes. So if you're using artificial intelligence or some kind of method, I mean, how are you going to know that that's wrong? Next slide. This is another example of clipping, which is there is a little white reference patch in the far bottom right corner, and that's a white reference. But then the area in the middle of that drawing is lighter than the reference patch. And so there's no information in that. Can we skip well, let's go to the next one. So I don't know how well you can see this, but this is something that was scanned at 600 PPI, but it's out of focus. My conclusion is that somebody placed it on top of the glass on like a Zeuschel scanner or something and just scanned it in a hurry, and it's all out of calibration. The next one, I've showed you, this is what it should look like. We got a nice scan, reference, a lot of breathing area around the original. I want to race through these things. Next slide. So we have, and I'll have a reference at the end of this, but we've published several products now called the Success Criteria Guidance, and it assists agencies in looking through all the different requirements that you have to do to meet the standards. Next slide. Another important document, which is the guidance and resources for non-compliant digitized records. That is records that were also known as previously digitized. Do not have time to go into detail about that, but we have these resources available, and I can talk about it in the questions.
Spent some time at the bridge meeting yesterday talking about that too.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And that's a very controversial, sensitive topic. But so far I've felt that NARA is not going to budge on giving a lot of exceptions on, we know that you did a lot of scanning and you didn't have regular requirements there. You did a really great presentation on the quality management guide. I'm honored that you had such nice things to say, but that's also available. And the next one of the final slides, this is where I want everybody to go when you have a lot of questions. This is a web page that we've created that has all the resources that I've talked about, and you can contact us at rmstandards@nara.com. I'll have the email address hopefully at the end. But here, please read these resources. It'll help you better understand what we're talking about and help you better articulate any questions that you have. Finally, these are the key takeaways. Please read the regulation. Please read the FADGI guidelines. The regulation is the statutory authority that agencies must follow, not FADGI. FADGI 3-star is not the requirement, but it's a great place. Modern textual is the starting point, but you may need to digitize at a higher degree. If you've got complex cartographic materials, for example, like a Civil War map, I hope they're already at NARA, but you never know. Here's a couple other things. Agencies must self-certify. NARA is not going to be inspecting your work. And so it's up to you to make sure you're doing it right. Also, please work with GSA to this is how we address the resources issue. OMB sets the budget requirements. Talk to your general counsel or your budget office. This is a serious issue. Digitization at this scale is an image manufacturing process. It is not a digital mailroom operation. And the standards are high because the originals will be destroyed. Thank you very much. I think my final, I got my own email. You're free to contact me, but the best way to do it is rmstandards, one word, @nara.gov. Thank you very much. And I'd love to hear from what people have to say.
Great, Michael. Thank you so much. Got some interesting questions offline. So again, I apologize for the weirdness in the Q&A functionality. I don't know what that deal is, but if you hit the raise hands thing, I should see you. And some people sent me some questions offline. So let me try and get to those. Let me start with maybe a controversial one, Michael, is that somebody says a vendor claims they can meet NARA's requirements. How do I know?
You hold them accountable by using the standards that are in. So this is a trust but verify. Vendors have every right to twist the truth. That's what they're going to do. But what we've done here is they cannot argue with nor deny the science and the background that's gone into developing these standards. So basically, you say, show me the results, or let me take a FADGI compliant test target and scan it, and you tell me what you're doing. Now, a vendor could say, yeah, we're FADGI 3-star compliant, or we meet the modern textual, because what they said is that they're just considering using grayscale. And so they could get away with saying that, but what you need to do is figure out what you have and then put a request for proposal. And this, again, is a situation where you work with the GSA. They have all types of analytical tools and research services that, and we are working with them to create a requirements document that's very similar to what we did with the universal ERM requirements, electronic records management requirements. And what that is that this gives vendors and vendors and service bureaus a set of requirements that they tell you. Like, it doesn't mean that every vendor can meet every requirement, but they tell you exactly what requirements they can and can't meet.
So another question here is why didn't you guys require OCR in the regulation?
It's something that we already have an infrastructure built in to do. There is kind of a two-part process to NARA. When NARA receives legal custody of the records, they go into something called ERA. And ERA is the actual repository where the actual record copy resides. What we also do is we put a derivative version out on our catalog, and that's the main place where the public interacts with those scans. And then we apply our own OCR to that, to our own requirements, our own standards. If you are OCRing, we'll accept it. We may not use it, but it's something that is, again, it's an art of practice. It's not something that's very quantifiable. And what we'd rather have you do is spend the resources making a great scan that can be repurposed by future technology. Another one that you may about to ask me, but the issue about 508 compliance, it is not required. It is required for your internal processes and all your outward facing, but scans of historic records or permanent records are not required by you for this purpose to meet 508 requirements. We have our own process for meeting that, I believe, and I'm not a 508 expert, but this issue comes up a lot. Again,
Yeah.
if you're doing it, you know what, we're not going to stop you from doing it.
Yeah, I remember back to the OCR thing, there was, when people were using that as some kind of a metric, when they would say 96, 97, 98% accuracy, somebody did, at large scale, that was like the equivalent of a gazillion jumbo jets crashing on a single day. Just because of the law of large numbers.
Yes.
And so it's not really a good measure of the integrity of the imaging process to begin with. How about, could you touch one more time? If a person had another question on this, on the raise hand thing, about not accepting bitonal images. Talk a little bit about that again.
The risk, okay, if this wasn't permanent, meaning where you have the ability to destroy the originals afterwards, and the potential for misapplication of this technique, and I've showed you in that slide what can happen with the loss of information. The agency is responsible for providing this legal, it's a legal and evidentiary document used in courts. And so, yes, we're taking a stand saying that a grayscale image that is the minimum standard, bitonal runs the risk of losing information. It is not an accurate rendition of a historic record. It is an artificial process that throws away information in order to go bitonal. You'll see there's a program called despeckle. Despeckling is a byproduct of going from the transition of grayscale to bitonal when you have a record that's like a gray record to begin with, a dingy paper or things like that. So these artifacts, they're called image artifacts, and they're undesirable. And there's something that you need to do quality inspection against. And so they introduce false information. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing, and I'm not saying that people who know what they're doing couldn't do a great job. If you go to our catalog, you'll see examples of bitonal scanning, but the difference is those are access copies. They are not permanent archival records. Those are just a derivative that were created. NARA itself would not be doing bitonal for its own records in its custody and then destroying those originals.
Yeah, and I think that difference between usage and preservation is something that people miss sometimes. And those technologies are really helpful in terms of viewing a document, but it destroys the integrity of the original.
By all means, you can do bitonal for temporary, even long-term temporary, as long as it serves your business needs. You're going to get a FOIA request or things like that. Those are the things you need to worry about. But it's a perfectly acceptable approach, just not for the permanent records, which is only about 3% of the total records.
And one last thing that again a person was asking about. Talk just quickly about that temporary permanent business again.
Yes. Is there a specific question or just?
No, I think people are, and I heard this yesterday on the bridge call as well. Is people are confusing the two.
Yes. It is not particularly if you're not a records manager, you don't even know what that means really. I do personally, this is personal, not NARA policy, feel it's a big mistake to digitize everything and then figure it out. Technically, there are regulations barring agencies from mixing temporary or called managing temporary and permanent together, because there's different standards that are applied and there's different legal ramifications. But essentially, go to your agency's records manager and ask, the first question I get when people ask me questions about what I should do, I ask them, the first question I ask, are they permanent or temporary? And if they're permanent, are they slated to get transferred to NARA? I don't know. Let me check. Well, that's the first sign right there. You shouldn't be wasting your time digitizing things to FADGI 3-star or whatever when you didn't have to. I'm not sure how much more I can help put clarity here, but there are some things called record schedules, and every record at an agency conforms to some type of record schedule that determines whether financial records are generally, 7-year temporary. If you got to go digital, then you scan them as bitonal and manage them for the 7 years, then you destroy them.
So we're just about out of time. So Michael, thank you so much for being here today. One of the questions that I posed on the poll originally was that, as I mentioned, this series is sponsored by QAI, and they're thinking of doing a session in either January or February, where you have like 5 or 6 scanners all in one place, and you can kind of like kick the tires, look at what they do, kind of ask all your questions, all that stuff. If you'd be interested in that kind of a session, then just send either of these folks, John Burgess or Doug Yates, an email, or send one to me at jmancini77@gmail, and then we'll try to figure out scheduling for something like that. But appreciate everybody being here today. Appreciate your patience with the strangeness on the Q&A tab, which I will have a chat about about Zoom. And happy holidays to everybody. I wore my special special red and white checked holiday shirt. So thank you all for being here today. And Michael, thank you for your expertise. I love nerding out with you on,
we
on
should
the
do this
imaging
again.
stuff.
We should have just a nerd session and 10 people show up.
But
thank you
thank
very
you all
much. And good luck to everybody, and give us a call.
Yeah, thank you all so
All
much.
right, bye.
Bye.